So first of all, talk about the campaign. Traditionally, it's thought that presidents are not elected based on foreign policy. Is that going to be true this time too?
For better or worse, that will be true.
Yeah.
I actually think Joe Biden's done a pretty good job on foreign policy. I might have one or two areas I disagree. But whatever you think about it, I don't think voters are going to have that foremost in their minds. It might be questions of his age or Mr. Trump's legal issues, maybe questions of the border or inflation, you name it. What's so interesting, David, though, is even though most voters won't vote on the basis of foreign policy, whoever's elected, given what you said in the lead-in, the differences, this election will have enormous consequences for the world and for America's relationship with the world.
Yeah, one of the things that strikes me, George W. Bush did not run on foreign policy issues, and yet he ended up being a foreign policy president, whether he wanted to or not. So give us a sense of some of the differences you think on some of the key issues. You've got war in Ukraine continuing, you've got Middle East, you've got climate, you've got China. What are some of the differences between these two people?
Well, actually, China is one of the areas the differences might not be that great. They are both pretty tough on China economically, not so clear about geopolitically. Mr. Biden is tough, not clear about Donald Trump. On trade, neither one of them is much of an enthusiast for trade, as you've noticed. Both wanted to get out of Afghanistan, but that probably ends most of the similarities. Ukraine, obviously. Fundamental differences. Joe Biden has really made that the centerpiece of his foreign policy. More broadly, the centerpiece of his foreign policy is allies. It's an ally-first approach. He sees allies as giving us a real comparative advantage, a way of leveraging American power. Donald Trump sees allies as an albatross, as free riders. He doesn't much care about them, doesn't much care about Ukraine's fate. That's probably the biggest single difference. Climate change, though, is also fundamental. Last time Mr. Trump was in, he took the United States out of the so-called Paris process. Joe Biden did the IRA, very much wants America to more than pull its weight in the climate area. Middle East is more complicated. Not clear that either would have a whole lot of influence over this Israeli government. Mr. Biden may try to have more influence. Not clear, though, that it's leading to much. When Mr. Trump was president, he wasn't much interested in the Palestinian issue. Joe Biden, however, is. Big difference there. Iran, neither one is quite sure what to do. Iran is getting closer to nuclear weapons capability. Donald Trump, some would argue, helped pave the way to that by pulling the United States out of the nuclear agreement. Joe Biden wanted to get the United States back in. It didn't work. Either way, who's ever elected, he's going to have to deal with an Iran that's probably on the so-called threshold of a nuclear agreement. Plus, you make a really good point more broadly. You don't know what's going to happen.
We tend to think of it as what's in stake for the United States in the election of president. I wonder what's at stake potentially for Europe in this election, because you mentioned Ukraine, NATO. Just this week, this has been in the news, given what former President Trump had to say about inviting President Putin to invade a country if he wanted. But also on the trade front, President Trump, when he was president, was not particularly friendly to Europe. What's at stake for Europe and the pressures that we put on Europe if, in fact, Donald Trump pursues the things he says he may?
Big differences, and I think one of the reasons Europe is now so focused, almost obsessed with our politics. Donald Trump represents potentially a fundamental departure. NATO, American commitment to Europe, has really been the mainstay of our relationship with the world for, what, 3/4 of a century. It is not clear that Donald Trump values that. Not clear that he would continue to support it. And he doesn't have to pull the United States out of NATO formally in order to essentially undermine the value of the commitment. If Joe Biden's elected, you know it's going to pretty much continue. But I think a fundamental question mark over America's commitment, not just to Ukraine, but to Europe across the board. Indeed, one of the things going on in Europe now, David, is how do they prepare for this possibility, either if Trump were elected, or even if he's not, if Congress begins to get in the way of, like they are in the case of Ukraine. So really interesting conversations are taking place in Europe about how they become either less dependent on the United States, more self-reliant, or some combination of the two.
One of the things you've talked about and written about for years, is the connection between domestic strength and our position in the world. You wrote a book on the subject, actually, a fascinating book. What about the choice between these two individuals and strength at home? I mean, on the one hand, it doesn't look like either one of them wants to address the deficit and the debt.
Right.
On the other hand, Donald Trump wants to have a lot more fossil fuels. Joe Biden doesn't.
Well, under Joe Biden, interestingly enough, we are the largest fossil fuel producer, oil and gas producer in the in the world. But I think it is true, to use the title, the foreign policy does begin at home. It doesn't end there, as I once pointed out in a conversation with Mr. Trump, but it does begin there. I think either one of them potentially faces political dysfunction. That's why the elections this fall matter, not just the presidential election. I assume there's going to be a Republican Senate. How the House goes could have a really big impact on the ability of, say, a Joe Biden to govern if he were to be reelected. You mentioned the deficit and the debt. I don't see either side with real enthusiasm to address entitlements. Can't do anything about interest on the debt. People are uncomfortable dealing with taxes and so forth. Discretionary domestic spending is too small to have a real impact. So one assumes that our debt is going to climb. The only question is how fast under either. There's questions of immigration. There's questions of public education. We can go, there'll be real differences domestically, and I think, yeah, our ability to set a model that the rest of the world respects, that's questionable. Our ability to get things done, that's really questionable, and that will undermine American foreign policy if we don't have the resources, we don't have the necessary continuity to be a great power. You need to be predictable and reliable, and right now I'm not sure that's consistent with the reality of American politics.